So here comes Harmer.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. And this gives me an opportunity to thank you and others, especially Hal Bailey, who was so instrumental in helping us start this educational program. And I have a picture to start the presentation of the Jung Foundation in New York, which reminds me to acknowledge my mentors, George Schemmel, for whom this program is named, and Jean Monnik, both of whom introduced me to the idea of Jungian psychology. And you will see how that plays out in the last story that we tell today. So it's been a remarkable and wonderful journey. I wish I could be in the same room with all of you, knowing that you're there, recognizing you by voice at least, if not by face, is a treat for me. And thank you again, Sandra, for this invitation. The first few slides I show you will be a little bit of background just to help us understand what it is that we're doing. I'm trying to figure out how to advance this. There we go. This is called Early Artistic Expressions of Life's Transitions. And human consciousness, which has caught my attention and to which I paid a lot of attention lately, is such a remarkable aspect of who we are and yet so difficult to define. And it's characterized by our ability to think and communicate symbolically through letters, words, language, and then ultimately story. And symbolic thinking can be expressed through art. And as you'll see in the first two stories that we tell today, that artwork is depicted on a cave wall and it tells a story. We didn't realize that until only recently. So some of the recent scholarship of looking at cave wall paintings is telling us that they're telling our ancient forebears, our ancient artists are telling us a story. And then we'll ask the question, with the artist's eye looking outward and inward, what is the artist telling us that's important? And we will realize by looking at these three stories that we'll tell today, two from cave walls and one from Homer, how that eye is looking not only outward, but also inward, and not only outward to our environment, but inward to our biology, and then ultimately inward to our psychology when we get to Homer. The importance of story. Words are symbols, and as symbols, they're used in language to create story, which can be metaphor and therefore symbolic, and is unique, a unique aspect of human consciousness. So this is going to be the platform upon which we proceed. Language, first spoken. We don't know how they did it, we don't know when they did it, but I suspect it was around the time we started to paint. Language first spoken, and then written. And that's when we get to Homer. The first written language is an essential feature of symbolic expression and therefore human consciousness. When language is assembled into story, the first artist, either a Paleolithic cave painter or a poet who's writing it down, tell about what is important to us. For example, life's transitions. And they depict these transitions in painting and in poetry. But why Paleolithic cave painting and Homeric poetry? They're so different. But they have one very interesting common denominator. Paleolithic cave painting and Homeric poetry are the earliest examples of visual and written story. And since we're focusing on story, that's why they both habit this talk. With superb artistry, both address topics that are critical to man, and we'll see what those are, his survival and his growth. And we'll examine examples of these original stories in our presentation today. But in red across the bottom in writing, I wanted to remind us that great art begins from the very beginning. Isn't it remarkable how the cave paintings are so terrific right from the very beginning? Homer, our first recorded author, is unsurpassed. And when we think about art, which is great from the very beginning and how different it is from the scientific life that so many of us lead, which is built incrementally, step by step, but not great art. It starts from the very beginning. I'm going to give us three definitions because they're all related to each other: consciousness, symbol, and metaphor, and art. Consciousness, because it's manifested through symbol and metaphor, which is expressed in art. And we'll see what those definitions look like, although difficult. These are three definitions of consciousness, which perhaps you've seen in a previous talk. but I like them and I think they help. I'll read them. Webster says it's an awareness or perception of an inward psychological or spiritual fact, intuitively perceived knowledge of something in one's inner self, an inward awareness of external object, state, or fact, concerned awareness, interest, or concern. That's Webster. Cambridge makes it very simple, the state of understanding and realizing something. I love that because it's so broad, it fits just about whatever you want to tuck into it. And then finally, the Oxford Living Dictionary, the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, the fact of the mind's awareness of itself, self-awareness, and the world. I've highlighted the words in large black letters here to help focus our understanding of consciousness. But having begun with that, we take a look at the brain. This is a pretty typical image of what the brain is, and yet it's been doing things like creating consciousness only for a relatively short period of time, I believe. It has to take in things by sound into the temporal lobe, by visual, by our eyes into the occipital lobe. When we start to be aware, our consciousness, this is the part of our brain, the parietal lobe, that gets particularly active. And all of this is unique to human beings, Homo sapiens. The other forebears of our Homo race, Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, and Neanderthal, with whom we are most closely related, did not do this. They could not do this. So this capacity, this biological capacity for conscious thinking has only been around for maybe 300,000 years, as long as we have existed. I like this model. It's sort of the church model of consciousness. It's offered to us by Stephen Mithen, and to me, it helps to not only simplify, but clarify the idea of consciousness and why it's so unique for human beings. Mithen talks about technical intelligence. For example, we've been able to make stone tools for a very long time, long before we had a modern consciousness. We've also been socially intelligent. We know about each other. We've lived in groups and bands for 2 million years. So we have that understanding. And we certainly know something about the natural history intelligence. We have to in order to survive in the dangerous world in which we evolved. But it wasn't until this whole concept of linguistic intelligence, capacity to symbolize, language itself is symbolic, that became available to us, that it opened all these doors to a general intelligence based on linguistic intelligence, which is not only spoken language, but written language, as we'll emphasize, that allowed us to manifest modern human consciousness. And that remarkable capacity, I don't think has been around quite that long. If we've been biologically human beings or Homo sapiens for 300,000 years, and we say that the artistic remnants of those people tell us something about their consciousness, we don't have the kind of art that we're going to talk about that goes back 300,000 years. We have the beginnings, but not the real thing. So my postulate is that modern human consciousness has not been around for maybe 40 or 50,000 years. The second definition is symbol and symbolic behavior. This is straightforward. A symbol is a mark, sign, or word that indicates or signifies or understands representing an idea, object, or relationship. And symbolic behavior is the ability to represent objects, people, and abstract concepts with arbitrary symbols, vocal and visual, and to reify them in cultural practice. And finally, art. It's very difficult to come up with a definition of art because some cultures and societies think something is artistic and others don't. But this bilateral way of looking at art, I think, is the most useful. Art is a diverse range of human activities in creating visual, auditory, or performing artifacts, artworks, expressing the author's imagination, conceptual ideas, or technical skill intended to be appreciated for their emotional power or beauty or both. And so one of the fascinating questions that I'm not going to be able to answer for us today is, did the artists in the cave paint those images because they thought they were beautiful? Or were they emotionally powerful and we think they're beautiful? A fascinating question. So let's start with our first story. I'm taking us to the cave Chauvet. It was discovered back in the 1990s, so it's only been discovered for about 20,000 years, or 20 years, excuse me. It's one of the oldest caves that we have in Europe, and so I like starting there. It goes back to 35,000 or 30,000 before the present. This is the beautiful Ardèche Valley, which houses the cave. And you can see over here this beautiful natural arch carved by the water as it goes through the limestone cliffs and carving out the caves themselves. This is the path that leads you up to the cave entrance. And these are the people who discovered the cave. On top is Jean-Marie Chauvet, sorry. And it's after him that the cave was named. These three people were spelunkers, amateur spelunkers, lowering themselves down over a cliff when a little breath of air puffed out from behind a rock as they were hanging there on their ropes. They removed the rock, saw a small opening through which a draft emerged, widened the opening, and lowered themselves into Chauvet Cave and saw for the first time in probably 20,000 years what was left behind. They instantly realized what they had discovered and exited the cave, allowing only the real experts to enter, and will benefit from that expert discovery. Here's a map of the cave. I wish I could show you all of it, but I'm going to show you only this part over here, which is the lion panel. As you may remember from the cave discussions last year, at this end is the skull of a cave bear sitting on a rock, looking much like an altar, the last step of the cave exploration. But over here is the lion panel, and we'll pay attention to that because of some new scholarship which tells us probably what that lion panel means. I thought you should see this. This is what the inside of the cave can look like, unadorned. This is just a natural cave. How stunning and beautiful it is. The new scholarship is offered by Marc Azéma, who's a cinematographer and an anthropologist in France. And he has looked at lots of these images and says, wait a second, there's more to these pictures than meets the eye. He thinks there's animation, and he thinks he can show that there's animation by the superimposition of one image over another. And also that you can see animation through juxtaposition, and I'll show you examples of those. With all of these different ideas of individual action, correlation, sequencing, and interlinking, and we'll show you what that means. Azéma says what we're really seeing is graphic narration of a story that's important to these people who painted Chauvet. Let's take a look at how Azéma puts this together. Before we do that, though, I would like to remind you that it is true for all hunter-gatherer societies, and our Paleolithic brothers were that. They all had a shaman. And the shaman existed in all hunter-gatherer societies to provide services to the community, accompanied by an altered state of consciousness. There are many ways that you could alter your consciousness. 3 drugs available to the ancients: mandrake, belladonna, and atropine, and different drugs that were available through plants, but also just deprivation of sound and sight, and being in a cold place for an extended period of time would all lead to hallucination. So that a shaman with an altered state of consciousness that included hallucinations were using these caves for important purposes. They were not living there. These caves were important places, and it's my hypothesis they were there for transition. This is a little example that is not narrated by Azéma. I'll add the words to it that shows you how he puts together some of these ideas of animation. Here he'll show by breaking down the superimposition and successive images how you can develop something that looks like it's moving. Remember, these people are in the cave with an altered state of consciousness, and how that would facilitate seeing this kind of thing. 6 legs, showing us how the animal moves. And now the sequential. This is on a rib, carved, 3 images. Take a look at this and how skillful it's done. The solid images are what you can see. The dotted images are filled in. But with the 3 images together in juxtaposition, the animal's running. And so we come back to our cave Chauvet. Azima took these ideas into Chauvet and said, I wonder what the painters, the shaman painters, I'm not sure if they were the same, but I assume, what were they doing in there? Were they telling us a story? And so these are panels from the lion chamber. And you can see, look at this rhinoceros over here. See the multiple horns, all suggesting movement. I'm going to take you through this and then show you how Azima puts it together. This is the first picture he'd like us to look at. These are 2 lions separated here by this red image. But these 2 lions are addressing each other with pre-copulation behavior. This is the female, this is the male. You can tell that because of the scrotum on this figure here. I have never seen the scrotum depicted in any other animal in any other cave except this one. So this is an important painting of lion pre-copulation behavior. Here are the lions that are looking over here, but what are they looking at? And Azima says, they're looking at this rhinoceros over here. These aren't just 3 lions that are painted on a wall. They're doing something. They're looking at a prey. In fact, here's another part of the lion panel. Here the lions are on the left, but look at the prey they're looking at over here. Here's a bison. And other animals, you can't see them all here, but they're stalking. This panel shows 2 lions stalking a bison. The bison is putting its foreleg on the lion's head, pushing it away. And by the way, this is a remarkable painting because it shows you how the artist used the cave wall. You can see how this part of the bison is coming around so that the head of the bison is looking at us. The side of the bison is disappearing back into the cave wall. They're using the artist uses the 3 dimensions of this cave wall to make this 3-dimensional bison pushing at the head of an attacking lion. Now we said there were shaman in all caves. You can barely see this here, but this is called the Venus pendant. And it's a combination of a bull's head and female genitalia, which you can see a little bit down here. Let me show you a better image of it. Here it is here. The bull's head and the female genitalia. Often we will see the shaman of a combination of a bull and a human. Now it's usually a man. In our next cave, it'll be a man. It's called the bison man. But here we have our shaman depicted as part animal, part man, overlooking all of this scene, maybe teaching us something. Here's a closer view of this remarkable image. Hanging and painted on a stalactite hanging down from a cave wall. And here is the lion pushing away, being pushed away by the bison, a little closer up. More stalking. Lions portrayed here in the distance, in the back of the cave, but they're looking at a horse and bison here. Azima says this is an active story that we're being told here. And finally, this is an engraving which is a little bit hard to see. You'll see it much better with Azima's animation, But this is the body here, the back, the belly, and the leg. And here's the head of the lion right here. And he's chewing on the head of a bison. He's killing his prey. If you take a look at those images as I've shown you, and then take a look at the outline of the cave, here, you can see the journey that one follows by following this yellow orange line. Here's the pre-mating behavior, the pre-copulating behavior. And by the way, here's the location of the lion panel in the cave overall. Here's the pre-mating behavior, the stalking, the approaching the bison being pushed away, more stalking, and then finally the consumption of the prey. Let's take a look at how Azema puts this together. Remember that if you're Paleolithic man, you're probably hallucinating by now by the time you've been in the cave this long, either because it's so dark or so cold or you're high on something and you've got the shaman there talking to you about what you're going to see. So this is how Azema puts it together. It's not narrated. I'll just let the story speak for itself. And you can move the light as you go through the cave. Here's the bison pushing away the attacking lion. Stalking. And finally consuming. So that's Mark Azema's creation of motion and storytelling in this cave, which is quite new. So I would like to summarize this first story this way. The polychrome paintings and the engravings in the lion chamber were sequenced to tell an important story of the natural world. If you lived in Paleolithic Europe 35,000 years ago, you had to understand the natural world, and especially the potential predators that lived there. And understanding the lion was really important to your survival. This is an important story that's being told on this cave wall. But remarkably, techniques of storytelling suggest motion in many of the formats. This is a form of proto-cinema. I want to move us now to a different story. Coming 20,000 years later, we're coming into the Caverne du Volpe. Again, I visited this cave, but wasn't allowed to examine it or to tour it because it's closed only for special archaeologists, anthropologists, and the experts. But take a look at the time difference. The last one was 35,000 BP. This one's 15,000 BP. So we're 20,000 years different. The story behind this cave, I think, is wonderful. Count Béguin, whom I met, told me the only reason that this cave was still in his family was that in 1789, the Béguin estate was so far from Paris that Robespierre couldn't find him. And so he was lucky enough to keep his land. This is down in the Pyrenees. In 1911, his great-grandfather, Henri Béguin, was sitting there exploring a neighboring cave with his 3 children, and one of them discovered a deer tooth. And he said to his kids, you know what? We have caves on our property. I wonder what's there. And it was just at this time that caves were starting to be discovered and understood, representing very ancient man with remarkable findings of cave paintings. So it was back at the beginning of the last century, this was being understood. And so Henri Béguin the next day went and explored the cave en Laine, which he knew he had on his property. And the first day his son discovered a beautiful spear thrower carved from a deer antler. I'll show that to you in the next slide. The next year, 2 adjoining caves, Tuc d'Audebert and Trois Frères, all linked together with the first cave, Enlène, were discovered. And these caves remain restricted and unavailable to the public. And the family explores them only a few weeks a year because their original founders said, we're going to get better at understanding this with new technologies, and we don't want to take it all now. Let's take it bit by bit. This was a brilliant foresight, and you will see why it paid off so handsomely with modern discoveries in this cave that's been available for exploration for over 100 years. That's the spear thrower that Henry's son found on the floor of Enlène as they were having their picnic. This device hooks into the back of a spear with this little device here and allows you to throw the spear at great velocity, much faster than you can just by holding it in your hand. It allows you to kill at a distance, which an arrow does. Man before this couldn't do this. Neanderthal couldn't do it. They were holding the spear or holding the rock. They couldn't let it go. But this spear thrower tells you something about the technical advance of the Homo sapien mind that allows you to build something that's not only so technically expert, but also beautiful. These are what the 3 caves look like. It's the best map I can put together. Here's Enlène, Trois Frères, and Tuc d'Audebert. We'll go into all 3 of them. But on the next slide, you can see how difficult this is because this part of Tuc d'Audebert is underwater. This part is above water. Here's a shaft which will connect them, and you have to go through a very muddy and dangerous part that connects the 2. So this kind of exploration is dangerous. Here's what the opening looked like. And here's what the exit of the river looks like as it leaves the caves. Wonderful, mysterious, beautiful part of the Pyrenees. I wanted to show you this work of art because it's so unique. It's a schist carving found in Enlène. It's the only carving or depiction that I can find anywhere in Paleolithic cave painting or sculpture or engraving that shows human copulation. But we do find it here. And that's the beginning of our story of what is important. What's the important story that's being told in these caves? And it begins with this schist, with a carving of human copulation. This remarkable, at the time unique discovery in 1912 was made by our Count Béguin, great-grandfather, who wriggled through a small opening into this cave Tuc d'Audebert, and with his lamp illuminated these 2 carved bison, clay carved bison that had survived for 15,000 years in a cave. It's impossible to imagine that something like this carved from clay could have survived so long, except for the fact that the caves were closed off with landslides that preserved a common environment that was stable with humidity and temperature, and that allowed for the preservation of these remarkable carvings. But they're important for another reason. This is a female bison, and this is a male bison. Her vulva is exposed, and this is pre-copulation attitude for these 2 sculptures. So when Béguin wriggled his way through and saw these for the first time, he was so excited. He sent a telegram to the Paris authorities that were responsible for the accumulation of this Paleolithic information and said, for the first time, we can see the Paleolithic man can sculpt. But not only in this cave was this remarkable sculpture, there were these footprints. These aren't just footprints, though, they're heel prints. They're not just heel prints, they're heel prints of an adolescent. They're too big for a child and too small for an adult. And they're heel prints, suggesting dance. Why were adolescent children dancing in this cave with 2 copulating or pre-copulating bison? This is a figure drawn elsewhere in the cave. It's a man with antlers, a beard, and a tail. Remember we said that all Paleolithic and all hunter-gathering organizations and groups had shaman. Well, here's a perfect depiction of a shaman. A tail, antlers, a beard, but mostly man. Let's see if there are others, though, in this cave. This remarkable figure, which I believe is a shaman, is placed at the most remote corner of the cave and overlooks hundreds of animals, so he has an important role to play. But are there others? I show you this picture only to emphasize how difficult it is to see the real images in real life. Here you can see two almost parallel lines, which turn out to be a nose flute, but it was only because of the very careful recreation of the images carved in this cave wall that we really understand what they were. Here they are. This took months to accumulate, and this drawing shows us what actually is on this cave wall. And they're all engravings. Interesting, isn't it, how so much of what was on Chauvet was painted, but so much of what's in the Trois Frères, Tuc d'Audebert, and Allen caves is carved. But look at these beautiful creatures. This huge bull here with perfectly depicted horns, a beautiful horse. But in the middle, what's this? Ah, here's the nose flute, and here's the rest of this creature, who we will call the bison man. And he's chasing two very different creatures, this one looking back at him, and this one trying to escape. Let's look more closely at what they are. Here's the bison man playing a nose flute. He has an erection. This creature here is a female with hindquarters of a deer and forequarters of a bison. We're hallucinating now. And this creature is a female reindeer with webbed forefeet, both females being chased by bison man with an erection. And here is the original version, which is so difficult to tell what's really going on. And here's another example of this. You can see how difficult and complex all of these images are. But down at the bottom, here we see another one of our bison men with an erection. We'll highlight him in the next slide. Here he is. So our shaman, our bison men with an erection populates so many of these carvings throughout the cave. The Béguin decision not to excavate all the caves immediately is borne out by the discovery 100 years after this cave was first opened, by this discovery of this huge phallus and natural vulva, which wasn't appreciated until a very sophisticated group of archaeologists and anthropologists were doing their work 7 years ago and discovered this. Also another image, obviously, of important sexuality. And here's how that fits within the other carvings, if you will, on the cave wall. But here it is. This is the image which is iconic for Paleolithic cave painting, called Le Sorcier, the sorcerer. I show it because you get an idea of the size of this huge cave. And here are two of the three brothers for whom the cave is named, Trois Frères. But up here, you can just see the back end of this remarkable creature. Let's look at him more closely. This is a photograph taken by Robert Béguin, which shows you what this creature looks like. Very difficult to tell. These are the eyes here, but a careful sketch done at the time of discovery by Abbé Breuil shows us exactly what this image is. Antlers, eyes of an owl, ears of a wolf. Who knows what this creature is, with the forelegs and the hind legs different? The important fact, the only human aspect of this creature are the genitalia. And this sorcerer, Le Sorcier, is iconic throughout all of Paleolithic arts, probably one of the most beautiful examples of symbolic portrayal that we have from this time. So here's my hypothesis of our story. This is a male puberty transition ritual. And why, if we put all these aspects of our discovery together, there's sculptures of mating bison in the room. And in that room, there are heel prints of adolescents who were dancing, and almost certainly with music. Let me digress for just a minute, because one of the most remarkable things that I discovered in preparing this is that the capacity to dance and the capacity for music are neurologically related in the human being, in Homo sapiens. It's stunning. We make music and we move our limbs at the same time. And if you think about what does an infant, a newborn infant, do when they start to vocalize, they always, unless otherwise occupied, are moving their arms and legs. Neurologically, vocalizing and arm movement are linked in human beings in such a way that we are natural song and dance people. So that's why I can say that if we see elements of dancing, we know there was elements of music in the cave at the same time. So in this cave complex with a depiction of human copulation on a schist, the sorcier painted on a high wall, the only part that's human are the genitals, dancing bison men with erections, and a recently discovered phallus and vulva, with multiple images of shaman important for transformation in the community. My hypothesis is that one of the purposes of this art was to portray in story the shaman in trance, celebrating, facilitating, assisting the transition of the adolescent, probably boy, through puberty to sexual maturity. This would have been the critical life transition for the community with a life expectancy of less than 30 years. What an important story to tell. I'm pausing because it's been fun to go through these caves, but we're going to go to a slightly different location. The last slide I have deals with a remark made by Maxime Aubert, who is a wonderful anthropologist in Australia, who has discovered cave paintings that are almost like the ones we're seeing in Europe, but he's discovered them in Kalimantan, which is in Borneo, tens of thousands of miles away, and they're older. And he says the early paintings were about mammals, those that he discovered in Borneo. The early paintings were about mammals. The later paintings were about people. Well, Aubert's comment is true for us too. Where the older painting in Chauvet, 35,000 years ago, was about animals. We were looking outward. We need to understand the life of a lion if we were to survive in that environment. But 20,000 years later in Trois Frères, we're looking at ourselves, the biological transformation through adolescence, and we're looking inward. We're looking now at ourselves. But both examples tell an important story of survival for the community. I'm going to shift now for the last story I'd like to tell to Homer. As most of you know, you can't have a cocktail with me without talking about Homer, for which I apologize to all of you. I probably owe every one of you this apology, especially my wife. Nevertheless, it's so much fun and interesting to me to do that, so I thank you for your forbearance. Here we've talked about 40,000-year-old Paleolithic caves, but those were stories told on painted cave walls. What happens when we can finally write it down? And the first time we were able to do that is 800 BCE, and that's the time when Homer emerged and was written down, and his work was the first written down with the Greek alphabet. I've looked at the beginning of the alphabet, and the story is just wonderful. And it's very long and complicated, but the point I would like to make for us today is that the Greek alphabet is the first time that an alphabet that was only consonants, that was the Phoenician alphabet, was taken, and then vowels were added to it. So for the first time, you have an alphabet that allows you to say what you're reading and to write what you're saying. That could never be done before, and that genius probably sat on the island of Euboea off the east coast of Greece, because that's where the most ancient form of ancient Greek is found. And that individual coincided with the Homeric poetry by Homer. And my fantasy is that somebody listening to Homer said, my God, that's so good, we got to write it down. And oops, we can't write it down because we don't have an alphabet. So they invented the alphabet so that Homer could be recorded. And as soon as that happened, within the next 100 years, Homer was all over the Mediterranean in a way that his predecessors never could be found. Stories in cuneiform or in hieroglyphics were limited to their origins of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But Homer's everywhere. And he's everywhere because we can write him down. Let me tell you a little bit about Homer, and then we want to talk about Jung's psychological model, which I think will be how we apply our Homeric discussion. Homer was a poet, probably from Chios. 7 cities claimed him because he was so famous, but he probably came from Chios. He's closely associated with Athens. He wrote 2 poems, a total of 28,000 lines of poetry, improvised, not memorized, in dactylic hexameter. He could only do it because he had multiforms, a story told in many ways, the same story told in many ways throughout. A third of it is repeated. He has recurrent episodes, phrases, and epithets and meaningful names. The word Odysseus means pain. So he had all kinds of mnemonic and artistic ways to be able to remind himself about how to tell a story, but there was none better to do this. And the reason he's important is that it's the foundation of all literary masterpieces for the Western canon. It coincides with the Greek alphabet, which allows for his presentation. And for me today, this artistic presentation of profound psychological truth, and I'll try to make the case for you based on an outline by Carl Jung. So next, we're going to go to Jung's psychological model with an emphasis on life transition. Remember, we said that we tell stories about transitions. Well, this transition that Jung is going to be talking about is important. It's midlife. And we're going to show how that Homer did that in the Iliad and the Odyssey with outlines of those stories. And then we'll show how Homer's stories conform to Jung's psychological model. We'll see this again a little bit later, but I thought that this would be helpful to show you Jung's model of the psyche because it will help us to go through the Homeric epics. Here we are in the middle, this great big circle. And here's the outer world, what we see around us. And here's our inner world, interior to our psyche. The ego is well known to us. It's who we describe ourselves to be and who we try to become from the time we're born until as we develop an ego. And it's a way of approaching the world and how we understand ourselves consciously. Sitting on top of the ego is our persona. It's what we project of ourselves to the world around us. So for example, I would have a persona of a father when I'm doing that, or a husband when I'm doing that, or a teacher, or whatever I do, I have a persona that suits that behavior. All of us have that. But this is all in the extroverted outside world of which we are conscious. This is consciousness. But Jung says, and we all would agree, there's a part of us that is unconscious, and that's down here, the unconscious, which is divided into the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Personal being more superficial and identified with us as individuals, collective being far older, way archaic, and common to all of us. It's this remarkable insight that Carl Jung had when he said, there is a 2-million-year-old man in us. We have a 2-million-year-old brain. It's not just a 40,000-year-old brain. And remember that all of that is still operational in some way. It's been adapted to our modern life, but we still have archaic remnants of that ancient brain, which is 2 million years old. That's when Homo erectus arrived. And that's what Jung calls our collective unconscious, and we all have it, we all share it. And that's very deep in our inner world. Part of that, for a man, part of that very deep consciousness, unconsciousness, for a man is what Jung calls his anima. That's his concept of the feminine. Jung says that as a boy is born and then becomes a man, still archaically ingrained in his psyche is an image of women. What is it about woman that he has, that he inherits in his biology that is about woman? And Jung calls that his anima, and he calls that an archetype. Definition that Jung provides over here, an archetype is the psychic equivalent of an instinct. So we have certain instinctual behaviors that are very, very ancient. We can think of what they are. The capacity to suck as soon as we're born is instinctual. We can't survive without it. So those are archetypes. Those are instincts which exist in our psyches, but they have a psychic equivalent of that instinct. And that's what Jung calls an archetype. And he would say that for a man, the archetype of the feminine that's deep in his unconsciousness is the anima. And that's the challenge. If we're talking about ourselves, here we are as ego, and Jung says, well, that's the first part of life. You've got to have an ego and then persona with which you confront the world. But there's a lot more to you that you've got to understand. And until you can integrate that, this unconscious part of you, to become your true self, that's what you're biologically destined to become if you can do it, means that you have to reach down somehow into that aspect of yourself that's not apparent, that aspect of yourself which is unconscious. And if you go deep enough into that collective unconscious, where lies, among other archetypes, the anima. And you somehow have to integrate that feminine into your conscious psyche. Jung says that is extremely difficult to do. That may be the most difficult thing that a man does. And Jung's daughter, Emma, defines the anima this way. The anima represents all the feminine personality components of the man, and at the same time, the image which he has of feminine nature in general. It is an archetype of the feminine in his psyche. It's a bit complicated, but I hope that dwelling on this a little bit will be helpful to give a framework in which we're now going to look at Homer's magnificent epics. Because I think you're going to guess that you're going to see Odysseus going through the first half of his life developing quite an ego. But then realizing as he gets to that point in midlife, there's more, and somehow I have to get that. And how am I going to do that? And how difficult is that going to be? Well, that's going to be the Odyssey, his trip home. Let's see how it works out. That whole process of bringing the psychological unconscious or archetype into the consciousness is called individuation. That's a word that Jung uses. And so the definition is increasing self-awareness leading to wholeness and becoming or transitioning to the person we are meant to be. Jung says not everybody can do this. It's very difficult to do, it's painful, and requires a lot of introspection and demanding work. But in so doing, we integrate the opposites within us, the male and the female. And along with that, we go from what is my life about to the search for meaning. Why am I here in the first place? So if the development of ego is the what of life, then the individuation is the why of life. Why am I here? And those are profoundly different questions. And I think that Homer tells us a story that works. I hope I'm not going too fast. This is going to be a brief outline of the Iliad. Don't worry if you haven't read it or don't remember it. The story is going to be easily told. It begins with a war, and the war is caused because Paris, the prince of Troy, wins from Aphrodite in a contest, Helen. The problem is Helen's married to Menelaus. And so that's the cause of the war. Helen disappears with Paris back to Troy. Menelaus, Helen's husband, is outraged and arranges all the Greeks to go and ultimately destroy Troy. But I've put on this map a graphic of the journey of Odysseus. Here he is going from Ithaca, his home in the west coast of Greece, over to Troy. He gets there, they stay 10 years in Troy, and there are battles that go back and forth, but that's pretty much it. And you see the symbol of the Trojan horse, which allowed the Greeks to win the war, Odysseus's brainchild, if you will. But that whole process, although it took 10 years here at Troy. So the journey of Odysseus, going from Ithaca to Troy, is pretty straightforward. This is the first half of his life. What about the role that women are playing in this? Well, I cite you two examples of what Homer says about women in the Iliad, and it is not kind. Ruin is woman, strong and swift. That's what Phoenix says in the Iliad, book 9. And then later, book 11, 12, Agamemnon says, ruin is Zeus's daughter, gliding over the earth and tangling men. That's the masculine view of women in this story. So to summarize the Iliad quickly, it's linear. It goes from here to there. It's totally masculine. The goal of that part of life is called kleos. It's the pursuit of fame. And so the goal of the Iliad is to become famous. And all of those warriors that are fighting are seeking to become famous. You can become famous not just by winning your battle, you can become famous in death. Achilles does. But the goal of that pursuit in your early life is fame. This is the first half of life. How different will be the Odyssey? Here's the background to the Odyssey. First of all, it's written 30 years after the Iliad, which I think is fascinating. It allows us to at least project onto Homer that he's a lot older. He maybe understands later life in a way that he didn't as he was writing the Iliad. And the main theme of the Odyssey, unlike the Iliad, which was kleos to get fame, the main point of the Odyssey is nostos, to come home. Now, homecoming can be literal. It can also be metaphoric. Are you coming home to what you should be, that complete person you would like to be, but find so difficult to become? And the answer, I think, is yes. This is totally non-linear. When I show you a map of where Odysseus had to go back and forth from one place to the next, from Troy to finally get home to Ithaca, you'll realize how remarkable his geographic meandering correlates with Homer's telling of the story. Homer doesn't begin at Troy and then take you back to Ithaca. No, he starts you right in the middle of things, in media res. He starts you with Odysseus stuck on an island, and he begins with a four-part story on Telemachus. The first 4 books of the Odyssey are about Telemachus, somebody else. And then when you find out where Odysseus is, you didn't find out how he got there until it's told to you in retrospect. So the point I'm getting at is that the story is told going back and forth in just the same way that Odysseus had to get home going back and forth. It's a remarkable rhetorical device. And we will see very quickly that the Odyssey is all about the women. There are some men there, but they play a minor role. And we'll see the extraordinary portrayal and manifestation of remarkable women in the Odyssey, which are going to impact on Odysseus in an important way. And therefore, this journey that Odysseus will take to go from Troy back to Ithaca will be a transition through the second half of life for him. And here's our model. This is the map that you saw earlier. And remember how we went from Ithaca to Troy? Well, that's not the same way we go to get home. As I told you, we started in media res, and the first 4 books are Telemachus' story. Here's Telemachus going back and forth, trying to find his father. But I have broken this down so that I will not tell you the story the way Homer does. I'm going to tell you the story chronologically, the way it actually occurred. If I do that, you will see the way in which Homer has constructed this. Now, he's disguised it with his in media res and retrospection and other ways of telling this story. He can confuse you as to where you are. I'm going to not do that. I'm going to tell you what happened when Odysseus left Troy until he finally got home. But you can see there's a lot of back and forth here. But I divide his homecoming into 3 parts. And this is exactly what Jungian psychology would do as they address midlife. As we go through midlife, leaving the first half and getting into the second half, this is a psychological process. This is not biological. And Jung would say, the first thing we have to do in leaving the first half first part of our life is we have to leave the old. The old is no longer working for us. Well, once we've left the old and realize it's no longer working, but we don't have a new, we're in an area that is totally surreal. It is liminal. Many people who have gone through midlife, we phrase it midlife crisis, and we have stories and jokes to tell about that, but people who talk about their midlife will understand how accurate this depiction is. It is quite liminal, off balance, ambiguity, disorientation. And it's not until going through that liminal phase that we actually can start to come home again, but with a renewed and changed point of view. And those three phases, I think, correlate almost perfectly with the three phases of Odysseus's return home from Troy to Ithaca. Let me take you through it with a commentary on each one briefly. As he leaves Troy, he goes first to Ismaros, where the Cicones live. And they say, well, you know, we sacked Troy and we got a lot. Let's sack the Cicones and we'll get some more. Well, they did. And they got greedy. And they stayed for an extra day. And in that extra day, the Cicones got some help, some additional troops. And when they counterattacked, they pushed Odysseus and his sailors right back into the sea, killing many of them. That was a hard lesson to learn. My paraphrase is, what used to work no longer does. And that's the lesson they learned from Wallace just sacked people on the way home. Here they come sailing around, and this is the Cape of Malea. I actually went there because I had to see where Odysseus rounded the Cape and why he couldn't sail back up the East Coast, and there's a good reason. The north wind that comes off of Greece around the Cape of Malea, if you're sailing a boat like his, you cannot tack a sailboat up the east coast of Greece with a north wind, and that's what he had. And it blew him off course all the way over to North Africa. And this time he lands at the land of the Lotus Eaters. The land of the Lotus Eaters are people using drugs to change their level of consciousness. They're basically stoned all the time. And half of Odysseus' sailors are stoned. Let me go back and paraphrase. You've just left a terrible war. How do we go through PTSD, many of our soldiers? Well, by getting stoned. And many of Odysseus's men are stoned. Remember what they used to do, the Cicones no longer work? Well, let's get stoned. Fortunately, Odysseus said, this is not going to get us home. So he had to drag his men with their mind-altering drugs out of the land of the Lotus Eaters and back to sea. We're still leaving the old world. We haven't entered the liminal phase yet. His next stop, he is able to sail because he's got a wind up to the land of the Cyclops. He doesn't know what the Cyclops is, but he finds a cave filled with cheese and goats and milk, and he makes the assumption, as the ancient world invited you to do, you're always welcome. Because Homer has this lovely phrase, welcome the stranger, speed the parting guest. That was the method of behavior of the ancient world. And Odysseus said, well, they're going to welcome me. And then they'll help me on my way. Well, he was wrong. What he wound up winding up in a cave owned by the Cyclops, single-eyed giant, who then when he came home, killed and ate some of Odysseus's men. So the old life that we are leaving, we haven't left it yet. But what he's confronting is the very narrow-minded, monocular, masculine, destructive view of the world, if you will. And it's only through guise and cleverness that he's actually able to escape. He fortunately does. And the next step he arrives at is the island of Aeolus, the god of the winds. He tells this story to Aeolus, who says, I get it, I'll help you. I'll put all the bad winds that you had to suffer going around the Cape of Malea, I'll put them in a bag, tie them up, don't let them out, and you'll have a fair wind all the way home. Odysseus says, thank you, jumps in the boat with his men, and back they sail. Here they go. This is part of our back and forth. They can actually see the fires on the shores of Ithaca, where Odysseus makes the mistake of falling asleep and trusting his men who don't believe that what's in that bag is what they're told. They think it's treasure and to be shared with all of them. They open the bag and belatedly find out that it's not booty and spoils, but the winds, and the winds are unleashed and blow him and them right back to Aeolus. What lesson did he learn? This is going to be a hard wind to get through midlife, and you can't sleep through it. You are going to suffer. Aeolus, the god of this island, when he sees Odysseus again, said, "Oh, the gods are against you. I will not help you any longer. You're out of here." And here's where it gets to be a little bit liminal. They no longer have a wind. They have to row. Here they're rowing their boat, and unfortunately for them, wind up at the island of Telepolis, where the Laestrygonians live. The Laestrygonians are giants that eat people. I'm abbreviating this story, but trying to make the point of how it fits into these three levels. We are now approaching liminal world. We are way off balance. There is nothing like the old world we left. They escape, and of course they wind up at the center of liminality in the island of Aia, where Circe lives. Circe is the Greek word for means to encircle. Aia means the land of the hawk. And it's there that she turns Odysseus's men into pigs. And it's here that Odysseus has to learn how to approach the feminine. He is warned by Hermes, who's sent by the gods in Olympus. You cannot just attack Circe. She will turn you into a pig too. You need to be very clever. You have to approach her deftly and with respect. And Hermes gives him the tools with which to do that. It's called Mole. Odysseus does. Circe realizes she can't turn him into a pig, and so she then befriends him. She is a perfect anima figure. You can't take her for granted. You treat her with respect, but she's necessary for you to get home. And through her help and beneficence, Odysseus is able to have his men turned back from pigs into men, and they're ready to resume their journey. But Circe says, "I'm sorry to tell you, you're going to get home, but first you have to go and talk to Tiresias. And by the way, he's in the underworld." Now, the underworld is the perfect metaphor for the unconscious. Every time we dream of the underworld, every time Greeks use that terminology, it is synonymous with the unconscious. So here we go in our liminal state with Odysseus into our deep unconscious, the underworld, where we have to find out from Tiresias, how are we actually going to get home? This, for me, was one of the most remarkable discoveries, because I found in going through Greek mythology that Tiresias has a very special place in Greek mythology. He is the only figure in Greek mythology to have been both a man and a woman. Hera turned him into a woman for 7 years, and during that time, he actually gave birth, or she gave birth. And then Hera turned her back into a man. And so this figure who rules over the underworld, Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes, he cannot see, but he knows so much, has been both man and a woman. What better figure to tell Odysseus how to get, quotes, home, close quotes, back to Ithaca, individuated back to his whole psyche, his whole personality. Here's a person who's been both man and woman. This is extraordinary. There actually are biological correlates to this. They are called sequential hermaphrodites, but they're very, very primitive life forms that we have that actually do exist, can be both masculine and then feminine and then masculine again. But here's a psychological model for this, which fits perfectly our story. And Tiresias says, yeah, you're going to get home, but it's going to be really hard. And watch out. These are things you can do. These are things you can't do, because if you don't, you're going to suffer a lot more. And then it's Tiresias who tells us how it actually ends. Homer never does. Tiresias says, when you finally do get home, take your oar, which is a weapon of war, and walk inland until it's perceived as a winnowing fork. When nobody sees that as a weapon of war, but as a winnowing fork, plant that in the ground, make your supplication to Poseidon for blinding Polyphemus' son, ask for his forgiveness, and there, once you've been forgiven for those sins, you will die an old man surrounded by your family. That's a vision of individuation, of psychological wholeness, if you will, that is extraordinary. It's how we know what actually happens to Odysseus. Homer never tells us, except in this story with words from Tiresias about how it will actually end up. But the suffering is not over yet. So when Odysseus leaves the underworld, he goes back and spends a day with Circe, who warns him he has to go past some very dangerous feminine images. They are the sirens who will sing him to his death. They are Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla is a six-headed monster who's feminine. Charybdis is a whirlpool, a perfect metaphor for femininity, both of which will destroy Odysseus if he's not careful. And finally, he makes it through there and winds up on an island called Thrinacia. He has to sacrifice I'm going very quickly here. Unfortunately, his crew sacrificed the cattle on this island. And after leaving there, all of his crew are drowned except for Odysseus, who then survives and winds up on the island of Calypso, the island of Ogygia. And it's there he stays for 7 years. My understanding of this is that's about how long it takes you to get over the PTSD of having fought in a war that's so awful as Troy. And it's there for 7 years under her care that Odysseus can actually recover. But then he's finally released after 7 years and winds up in a raft that he builds. And the raft is destroyed by a storm, but he makes it to the coast, finally, of an island called Phaeacia. And here's where we start to leave liminality and come back to normality, a new normal for him. When he gets on the island of Phaeacia, he first meets a beautiful young woman named Nausicaa. She's a teenager who falls in love with him and wants to marry him. And he is so deft with his words that he can speak and relate to her and ask for her help, but not offend her. And she takes and leads him to her mother, whose name is Arete. These two feminine figures of Nausicaa and Arete are a step closer to what is normal human life, a long way from Circe and from Calypso. But they're very idealized. But once he leaves this island and is taken finally back home to Ithaca, that's when he leaves this ideal world of Phaeacia with Arete the queen and Nausicaa the princess, who are idealized forms of humanity, and he actually gets back to his island of Ithaca. And that is where he comes together finally with Penelope, his wife, who's been waiting for him. The story of the reconciliation is too long for us now, except to say that it happens. And it's extraordinary because it took a while for Penelope to recognize him. And it took a while for Odysseus in humility to approach her. But when he finally does, they come together. And Athena, who has overseen all of this as the divine overseer of this story, allows them to come together in their conjugal bed and then lengthens the night so they have more time to enjoy each other's reconciliation. It's a very beautiful scene. I can't leave this slide without a comment about Athena. Haven't said anything about her. But remember, it's under her guidance that Odysseus has made all of this trip. She's the goddess from Olympus. But don't forget who she is. She was born a virgin goddess out of the mind of Zeus. She was born in Greek mythology right out of Zeus's head. Is there any better example, mythological example, of the psychological projection of the anima than Athena? So here we have Athena guiding all of this with all these anima figures influencing Odysseus and getting him home. I'm putting up this model of Jung's psyche once more to remind us that here we've got the anima integrating with the ego into the self, which is the full personality, the full character, the full person of Odysseus. A very difficult journey. Jung says, but we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true at evening will have become a lie. How so true for our trip, our journey with Odysseus. Odysseus of the Iliad is developing his kleos through ego development in a battle with Troy. But on the way home, Odysseus in the Odyssey is achieving his nostos, his homecoming, and individuation and meaning in his life by going through his midlife. I'll finish up with 2 slides that recapitulate. The journey is first linear in the Iliad, and then circuitous in the Odyssey. A journey to and then through midlife. The return begins at Ismaros, what once worked no longer does. Then to the lotus eaters, forgetting is not the answer. To follow Polyphemus, the destructive, primitive masculine must be confronted. And then appear all the feminine influences in so many iterations under Athena's guidance. Circe, Tiresias, man and woman, the sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, Calypso. We didn't mention Ino. Nausicaa, Arete, Eurycleia, and Penelope. All of those powerful feminine influences. They all influence Odysseus in the process of individuation and in the incorporation of his anima into his complete self. This journey leads Odysseus from the pursuit of fame to the pursuit of wholeness and meaning. Nostos, or homecoming, which is achieved through a process of individuation or psychological maturity with the incorporation of the anima into a complete whole psyche, his self. The Iliad and the Odyssey are foundational works of the Western canon and describe in poetry the transition of Odysseus through midlife into wholeness, a hoped for universal process defined by Jung as individuation. So to finish, words or symbol and story metaphor, first spoken, painted, and then written, are manifestations of developed human consciousness. In our first example of Chauvet, the artist looked outward, examining with tools of graphic narration the life transitions of lions, something we had to know about in painted proto-cinematic story. 20,000 years later, in our second and much later example of cave painting at Trois Frères, the artist painted and sculptured and engraved sexual images, which accompanied by heel prints suggesting dance and accompanied by music, celebrated or facilitated the physical transformation of the male adolescent in puberty, the most important transition for humans at that time. And then finally, Homer's epics, the first works recorded using a fully developed alphabet, become a foundation of the Western canon, and in poetry present the psychological transformation of a man in midlife to a state of psychological and spiritual completeness consistent with Jung's model. With an understanding of the psyche and self-examination, the psychologist, the modern psychologist, provides insight into the human condition. But it was the artist who did this first. With the emergence of consciousness, words, language, and story expressed through ancient cave images and then writing, came artistic inspiration and expression of life transitions through painting and poetry. Thank you.
Time for questions.
I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm not sure where we go from here.
Okay, we have a few minutes left for question and answer. So if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question. Mr. Hailstone? Oh, no? Oh, okay. Oh, Joe. Okay, here's Joe. There you are, Joe.
I'm unmuted.
Yep.
Yes. Dr. Burden,
Hi,
hi. That was fantastic.
thank you.
My wife and I sat with you through your courses, so this was a great refresher summary. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
My question is, it seems a bit disjointed. I don't know what the word I want to use is. At the end of the Odyssey, for Odysseus to have to slaughter all of the suitors.
You know, that is such a good point, and I avoided confronting that conundrum. But you have not let me do that. But let me tell you what my take on this is. You're quite right, Joe, that Odysseus has to slaughter 109 people that are contesting for his wife. It's a brutal battle. And it at first brings to mind the struggle on the battlefields of Troy. But here's the difference. At Troy, the battle is on the beach in front of the walls of Troy for all to see. Everybody can see what's going on in that struggle. But in the struggle in Odysseus's house, nobody sees it. All the people that live in fact, Odysseus makes the point, keep this quiet. You can't let the town people know. So my extension of that metaphor is that this is the internal battle that he is fighting, manifested as a struggle of the suitors for his wife, but still the internal struggle that he has had to fight that others cannot see because it's inside his own psychology. I don't know if that will satisfy you, but that's the way I at least rationalize it.
Well, I think that also transforms it from a battle for fame, I guess, correct?
That's true. And you make a good point. He doesn't want to be famous anymore. He's done with that. He just wants his house back. And what he really wants is to get his life back. And what he really wants is to become whole with his wife. And the beautiful foretelling of the end of his life by Tiresias in the underworld, you will be surrounded, an old man, as you die, surrounded by your family. Homer, in a way, is saying that is the meaning of life. And he's going to give us a little glimpse of that through that description by Tiresias.
Thank you.
Thank you. You quickly unveiled one of the weaknesses here that I had to sometimes bob and weave, and I have to think more about it, but that's the best we can do, and you've helped me. Thank you.
Yes.
It's like
But I
Hal.
was bound
Hal,
to
you
be
have a
able to-
question there?
Yes, I do. I think that was a great question and a good answer, but I wonder if that has anything to do with something you didn't mention, which was the animus.
Okay. And yes, thank you for that. I've avoided the animus just because it would have been a bit long, but, and I'll say this and then leave it back to you, Hal. The animus is the psychic equivalent in a woman of of her masculine, that the anima is for a man in his psyche. But back to you, Hal. What would you do with that?
That's unfair. But it does seem to me that if the anima and the animus are in both of us, male and female, then that animus has to be worked out as well and identified. And I just wonder if that Jung provides more insight into that, or if there's a way to develop Jung.
That's a really good point, Hal. And I think what Jung would say is that a man does not have an animus. He doesn't need it. He's masculine. But what he does need is the feminine alternative to his masculinity, which is psychologically his anima. And for a woman, she doesn't need an anima. That's who she is. She is the feminine. But what she needs is the psychological equivalent of the masculine. She can never have it biologically, but she needs it psychologically, and he calls that the animus. So that's how it works in the two sexes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And brilliant discussion. So thank you, Harlan.
You know what, for me, Hal, is such a thrill. And by the way, I recognize your living room because I had so much great learning in the living room. I remember reading Plato in that living room, so it's a nice recollection. But what's so important here is that as we are human beings, there's nothing more important to us than to tell each other our stories. I know that in my practice of medicine, the best thing I could do was to listen to somebody tell me their story. That was more important than almost anything else. We have stories that we got to tell. And if you look back at, if it was the first story that was told in Chauvet, at least the first story we know, that was a very important story. We don't tell trivial stories. We tell important stories. We have to know what the external world looks like if we're going to survive with lions. And we're going to have to know what the internal world looks like if we're going to have another generation. We got to know what puberty looks like. And then ultimately, if we're lucky enough, and I think that at Homer's time, remember in Paleolithic time, you weren't living to 30. You were all dying if you were lucky to get through adolescence. That was your transition. But by the time we get to Homer, we're living longer, and the chance to live through midlife is there. In fact, Homer had experiences of people who were gone through their 40s and into their 50s, 60s, and 70s and knew that. And his story informs the transition in midlife in an extraordinary way. He's the first to be able to do it, and he knew it was important. And that was the first story he told.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would say we had a course today. We didn't have a lecture. Would you all agree?
Thank you.
And that was absolutely amazing. I know that you have another appointment, so I think that the people who have questions should write them up and we'll send them to you.
I'm happy to have some little time now, but I'm happy to do it that way too, if you wish.
Yeah, but I did have a question for you too. I was wondering as we sat here whether you consider Jung a scientist or a poet, or you can save the answer if you want to take another question.
That is such a good question, Sandra. It deserves an answer. I can tell you what Jung thought of himself, but then other people think differently. Jung said, I am a scientist. He believed in Darwin. Darwin had profoundly influenced him. And his assumption was that if we keep looking long enough, we're going to find physical correlates within our brains of the psychological truths that we know to be so. All we have to do is know some more. The whole idea of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, the duality of man, the mind and body as being separate. Jung completely rejected that, said, we've gone way beyond that. We just don't know enough. And he was at the very beginning of our understanding of this. So he saw himself as a scientist. Now, in a way, it was unfortunate because he dabbled in the parapsychological. He dabbled with astrology.
Mm-hmm.
He dabbled with other things that were not scientific, that tainted his reputation. So that in modern psychological terminology, those people who are standard psychologists look on him a little bit askance because of his curiosity more than anything else. But that's the part of his history that I think distracts us from calling him a true scientist.
Okay.
Thank you. Great question.
Did you say that you could take another question or?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Does anyone have one?
We're there.
We're there.
Let me simply say thank you to all the lovely people who I know and little tiny versions of you that I can see. And how great this was to be with old friends. Thank you for including me.
You're the founder and you've taught us so much in one day that we'll just have to have you back because we need to listen more. Of course.
Well, as I say to you, Sandra, the answer is yes. What's the question?
Right.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Harmer.